You're watching Africa Trade and Business. I'm Bronwyn Seaborn. In this episode, we discuss South Africa's plan for universal healthcare and what will be required to ensure its successful implementation. But before we get to that, here's a look at news making headlines across the continent. The ratings landscape is set for change. The African Union plans to launch its own credit ratings agency. The AU says it's not looking to replace the big three, but rather to widen the diversity of opinions. Here's more detail in this packaged report.
The African Union is planning to launch a new African credit rating agency next year. The aim is to address the group's concerns that ratings given to countries on the continent are unfair, an official told Reuters. The agency would craft its own assessment of the risks in lending to African countries. It would be based on the continent, be self-funded, and would add context to the information investors consider when deciding whether to buy African bonds or lend privately to countries, the African Union said. The African Union and leaders of member nations allege that the big three ratings agencies, Moody's, Fitch and S&P Global Ratings, do not fairly assess the risk of lending to African countries. They also claim that they are quicker to downgrade them during crises such as the global health crisis. Broadly speaking, credit ratings are designed to gauge a borrower's risk of default and factor in the terms on which banks and others will lend to them. All three ratings agencies have denied bias and say their ratings follow the same formula across continents. Moody's, Fitch and S&P Global Ratings did not immediately respond to a request for comment.
Ghana is reopening a debt exchange that was originally settled in February for another $1.1 billion of local bonds. The exchanges are part of efforts by Ghana to restructure both domestic and external debt. That was a condition set by the International Monetary Fund for a $3 billion bailout secured in May. Ghana defaulted on most of its $30 billion external debt in December after its currency tumbled and inflation and debt servicing costs soared. Kenya's central bank has capped the amount of dollars that money transfer companies can sell to an individual customer. That's been set at $100,000 per day. The bank says it found that the firms have been participating in the wholesale foreign exchange market without complying with various guidelines, standards and codes that govern that segment. And so the move will create a fair and orderly market. Well, it's a hot topic in South Africa right now, that being national health insurance and the Herculean task of implementing it. Joining me to discuss the topic further is Zizile Lephalala, the sector head for hospitality, construction and healthcare at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking. Zizile, thanks so much for your time today. So I did describe the NHI in South Africa and its implementation as being Herculean because it's definitely not something that's going to happen overnight, right?
Absolutely. Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me on studio today.
Great. So I say it's Herculean because there's just so much uncertainty at the moment. What would you say are some of the biggest questions around NHI that need to be looked at and addressed kind of urgently in order for this to get going?
So in my view, Brian, there's a lot that need clarity in terms of the NHI bill as it stands today. And one of those key things is really clarity around the role of private sector, specifically around the medical aid scheme, what the NHI will not cover or will cover, and as well as the financing of the fund. So we know where we are in terms of the macroeconomic as a country, and there needs to be clarity from the Minister of Finance. I think that will be through the money bill that needs to be documented to clarify how this will be financed, as well as, of course, ensuring that there is sufficient healthcare professionals in the systems to cater for the population.
So a lot of questions still around the NHI. Are you seeing that uncertainty really hold back investment in the sector?
There is that regulatory overhang on the back of the NHI bill as it stands, and fortunately we've seen some investment come through it, specifically from the development financial institutions, given the social impact that healthcare has in the country. We know that the private sector only caters for roughly 15% of the population, whilst the remainder is actually serviced by the heavily burdened and under-resourced public sector. So the investments in the sector yes, it's limited because of the overhang due to the NHI bill, but we are still seeing some investment. I think the clarity with the NHI bill going forward will provide investors with better clarity in terms of the investment that's necessary, actually.
Whenever NHI comes up, it's always a discussion around how important public-private partnerships are to getting NHI really rolling. Are you of the same opinion? Is that how you see it really being implemented properly? Public sector, private sector working together to get this going and to really make sure that we have the resources necessary to make affordable and universal access a reality for most of South Africa.
Absolutely, Brian. I mean, we know right now that the public sector is heavily burdened. They can't do this on their own. So we need a collaboration between private and public sector to be able to service the bigger nation of South Africa in order to have access to quality healthcare. So that's definitely one of the key requirements for a successful implementation, in my view.
You talk about the development finance institutions being willing to invest because of the social impact.
Yeah.
What's the willingness of private sector? How are you rating their muscle to get involved? We know that there is this uncertainty. We've already highlighted that is kind of standing in the way.
Yeah.
But do you think if that certainty was to come to the fore, we would see the private sector coming more so to the ballpark, if that's what we want to call it, and putting their money where their mouth is, really seeing opportunity and investing?
Absolutely. I think without a doubt, if there is more clarity in terms of how the private sector and the public sector would work, there'll be higher investment by the private funders and the private stakeholders in the sector, because there's really a huge opportunity for them as well, given that they'll be moving from servicing roughly 9 million population of South Africa to over 60 million. So that's a huge opportunity, but without clarity and the overhang of this bill in its current form, it kind of limits the investments from the private funders or stakeholders.
While we wait for that certainty to come through, are there some low-hanging fruits that can already be picked in terms of getting the sector ready for the NHI implementation that's probably coming a lot further down the line?
Absolutely, Brian, and I think one of the key ones that I can think of is perhaps regulatory or restrictions that are around training of the healthcare professionals in the country. We know that we have a huge shortage. Historically, it's been doctors that have been emigrating outside to leave to the developed markets, but most recently we've seen a high shortage and immigration of nurses as well, specialized nurses, which is of course a huge requirement to quality healthcare in the country. I mean, if I look at it statistically, we're looking at, from a nurse's perspective, in South Africa, we have one nurse servicing over 200 patients, whereas globally, it's a lower, much lower number. I think it's around 6, one nurse to 6 patients. So you could already see that there is a huge need for us to train more nurses, as the nurses that we have also are kind of on the elderly age. In the next 5 to 10 years, most of them would have been retired. So that needs an urgent, I think, attention.
Is that on the radar? Is that being looked at, do you feel, in the sector?
I think the private sector has certainly caused a lot of noise around that. Now the hope is that the government will be able to respond in a positive manner to ensure that we do train sufficient nurses, as well as other healthcare professionals such as doctors as well, that they're able to train them privately through private colleges as well.
From everything you're saying, Zizile, I can see that there's just so much potential in terms of investment in the sector, in terms of job creation in the sector, if we can just get some certainty and some regulation frameworks perhaps going, and then we're really going to see it unlock. What is the potential for South Africa to almost position itself in the African context as well? Because there must be that opportunity that if we can get this right, And I'm talking about even manufacturing some of our medication locally, etc., to support the NHI, that we could service more than just South Africa, right? We could service countries in, our neighbours in Africa. Is that potential there? Is that being considered? Or are we just bogged down in the current uncertainty and looking broader than that right now, just not something that we're going to consider?
It's a good question, Brian, and it's quite interesting because currently the private sector actually services not only the population of SA, but we have a lot of medical tourism, meaning people that come through into the country to access our private healthcare. So in my view, and my understanding of NHI is the basic requirement is they servicing the nation in terms of having access to quality healthcare. As we know, the majority doesn't have access to quality healthcare, given in terms of where the infrastructure is for the public sector. So I think that'll be a first tick box, to be fair, and then only once that's bedded down, we can look into how we offer increased medical tourism to our neighboring countries. We already know that we see a lot of inflow from the likes of Zimbabwe and other neighboring countries that come through to access our healthcare system. So I think the more we strengthen it, the more we're able to assist those neighboring countries ultimately.
Certainly a lot going on in the sector. I'm sure I'll be chatting to you again and again over the years as we try and get NHI off the ground. But for today, let's leave it there. Zizile, thank you so much for your time today.
No, thanks, Brian. It's been good to be here.
Great.
Thanks.
That was Zizile Lephalala, the sector head for hospitality, construction and healthcare at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking. And that's where we leave things for this week's episode of Africa Trade and Business. From me, Bronwyn Seaborn, and the rest of the team, it's goodbye for now.